Welcome back to another Bike Bros YouTube bike review, and today is going to be something kind of different because today we're looking at a bike that we don't even sell in the store. This isn't a brand that we sell or have ever sold, but this is a model that I think people really should know about, and I think a brand that a lot of people probably really need to know about. And hopefully for you people outside of Canada, it'll give you some appreciation for the cool stuff that we have from smaller builders in Canada. In today's video, we're having a look at this Brodie Elan 2.0. So the basics on this bike are, this is a $21.99 chromoly steel adventure gravel sort of a bike, and this comes in right around 30 pounds. The actual model that we're looking at today of this Elan 2.0 is what they call a 54 or a large. I would honestly, I would name it a little bit differently. That 54 is 54 centimeters as your seat tube length. I personally think on anything drop bar that we should be looking at a horizontal top tube length, which in this case would be a 58, and which I would say is probably about as average a size large sort of measurement as you could possibly ask for. Now, part of the reason that I want to do a video about this bike is because this sort of thing is just becoming rare. And that is because a lot of the big manufacturers don't want to bother dealing with a special factory to make a chromoly frame. So that stands for companies like Trek Specialized, Giant, a lot of those big mainstream guys, to deal with an extra factory just so that they can make one extra model of bike out of chromoly steel isn't something that they think is worth their time. So this is too small of a niche for them to bother with. On the other hand, the reason that I think it's really worth covering is I love channels like bikepacking.com, things like that, and looking at the underground, really hardcore bike adventure, bike packing scene. And you look at this then comparing to things like Surly's, Tumbleweeds, all sorts of bikes that in many cases you're looking at frame and fork prices approaching what this complete bike is. So at $21.99 Canadian, this is probably looking like about a $1,600 American bike. So for those customers in the States who maybe get excited about something like this, I would say look north of the border and find out where your local Brodie dealer is, because I think this is a really good way to get yourself into something unique and something that is really practical and going to save you a lot of money while still getting a great pile of parts attached to that frame and fork. So for those of you who just stumbled upon this one standalone video, my name is Graham. I own a bicycle shop in Cochrane, Alberta, Canada called Bike Bros. And what I'm typically doing in these videos is having a look at the product we sell and discussing a whole bunch of things about the specs, the features, geometry, all sorts of stuff, including the hits and misses of particular bike models. So you've obviously stumbled upon something a little bit different today, because this Brodie that we're looking at isn't even a bike or a brand that we sell in store, but it is a bike that I think is really worth mentioning. And the reason we don't sell it is not because I don't like this bike. I'm a huge fan. It's just that we're in a town of 40,000 people. We have a limited amount of space. And so having some of these niche bikes in here is just a bit of a challenge. And I mean, it's a challenge for me because I wish I could fill the place with all the really cool niche-y stuff. But that is the reality of being in a town of 40,000 people and in predominantly a mountain bike market. So if you like this sort of thing, what I hope to do in the future is a lot more videos featuring bikes that I'm just a fan of. Quirky stuff, cool stuff, usually in the mountain, gravel, adventure sort of bike categories. And we're going to be doing a little bit more talking about the industry and potentially bits and pieces of bikes, all sorts of things to just make this one of those interesting channels that cyclists want to tune into. So you've stumbled upon this video about the Brodie Elan 2.0. Check out Brodie's website. They've got a bunch of really unique bikes, some sort of plus size tire bikes, chromoly frame stuff, chromoly frame, I think, or alloy frames with carbon forks in fully rigid sort of mountain utility bikes. I think they got some cool stuff, so check it out. And once again, if you live in a close to the border city in the States, I think this could be a a way that you could get your hands on something that otherwise would be quite expensive and may sort of suit a really cool niche within your N+1 sort of fleet. So thanks for tuning in. We'll get carried on with looking at a bunch more of the specs and details of this Brodie Elan 2.0. So I will admit that I am friends, I wouldn't say friends, I am acquaintances with, and I really like a couple of the owners of Brodie. Brodie is a brand that goes way back to the late 80s. Paul Brodie, a famed bike builder and mountain bike Hall of Fame member, has been around for ages, and he was around at the startup of Rocky mountain bicycles. And in fact, he came up with some of the very distinctive design ideas that really helped Rocky Mountain to get launched in a huge way. He then stepped out, started Brodie Bikes, and then a number of years ago, I want to say maybe 15 years ago, he sold the brand to a few of the Vancouver hardcore riders, Bruce being a former superstar in the Canadian cross-country race world, Andrew being a superstar of cyclocross, and in general, they're both two very knowledgeable, practical people. So those are the people that we have behind the Brodie brand. And now I'm going to get into a bunch of the details about this particular bike, so maybe you can see if this is something that excites you. So anybody who's watched many of my videos before will be a little bit interested to see that I'm actually a huge fan of a bike with a 2x drivetrain in this case. I typically am the biggest member of the I love 1x drivetrains, but in this particular case, I think a 2x is quite a practical option. So with that said, what we have on here is a combination of GRX 2x10 with Tiagra lever shifters on here. Now the reason that they have done this is because this bike is running with mechanical disc brakes, and so you cannot get mechanical disc brake lever shifters in the GRX lineup, so they have used Tiagra so that they can still drive the 2x10 GRX drivetrain, but they can use a set of mechanical disc brakes. So for a lot of people, if you're thinking about sort of regular spec, a mechanical disc brake system would be seen as a little bit of a down spec. I think this is pure practicality here. One of the things that you get with people that do adventure biking of different sorts is they're worried about any sort of on the trip, on the travel, maintenance that they might have to do. And so a mechanical brake system is going to give you the easiest to service thing on the road. So what we have is a double-butted chromoly frame here. So chromoly, for those people not familiar, typically you can tell a chromoly frame by looking at just the size of the welds. They tend to be a lot smaller, and tube diameters tend to be a lot smaller on chromoly compared to aluminum as well. Now the special thing about chromoly is that it's got quite a good strength to weight ratio. It's weldable because it's not reliant on the heat treatment, which is what makes aluminum frames strong, is the post-weld heat treatment. So in this case, if something happens on the road, you could weld one of these bikes or get it welded. But the fact that it is chromoly means it's going to be very unlikely that it's going to need welding, because chromoly just tends to be a very durable material, and a lot of people really like the ride feel of chromoly. What that tends to do, chromoly just has a certain sort of frequency of vibration that it tends to absorb, and so it tends to give a nice muted, almost like riding with a little bit softer tires on a bike, is the way people would compare it to, especially an aluminum bike with extremely thin-walled, thick tubing. You tend to get a very, very transmittive bike in that case with aluminum. So we get durability, we get a really nice ride feel. So that's the materials. That double butting I mentioned, that just means that what they'll do is the actual wall thickness as the tubes get to the welds is going to increase so that we still have a lot of strength around the heat affected zone of the welds. In addition to that, we have things like these gussets that they have underneath the top and underneath the down tube there. that is a pretty normal thing that you'll see on chromoly frames. You see it on touring frames like this, you see it on BMX bikes. It's just a good way to get extra strength at those sort of high stress zones on a bike. Now, one of the things that I do really like on this bike is the fact that we are looking at through axles, front and rear. So through axle just means that we've got a fatter axle going through, and it's actually attaching both sides of the frame and making the axle a structural part of the bike instead of just holding the wheel, preventing it from falling off. So there's a couple things about that. Under hard braking, you then have the axle strength, which helps you to not sort of have weird flex in the back of your bike, but you also have absolute placement. When you put your wheel into the bike, you're not going to have it sort of slightly offset one way or the other, depending on how tight you do your axle or just not pressing the wheel in. So that's really nice because you are less likely then to have rubbing brakes because of a slight variance in how you've put your wheel in the frame. As I mentioned, we are looking at a GRX drivetrain. So this is a gravel group set. It's got the Shadow Plus, meaning it doesn't have a huge B pivot here. It does have a clutch. So that clutch, as I will always point out, a clutch has an off position, which makes it easy for the derailleur to flex. The only reason that exists is so that you can make it easier to take a wheel off. In the on or engaged position, that clutch gives you a lot of tension in this little sort of knuckle here, and that adds to your chain tension, which just gives you a system that's going to be a little bit less likely to have a chain bouncing off. Within this, as I mentioned, we've got 2x10 drivetrain. We have quite small chain rings on here. We're looking at a 4630 is the range of gears, and I believe we're looking at an 1134, maybe an 1136 that we have on the cassette on the back. And so that will mean that we get better than 1-to-1 ratio when we're in climbing mode. And that is where it's an 1136. And so that is where, because this is a touring bike, and it wouldn't be ridden the way, or not designed to be ridden quite the same way I would ride this bike, by having that 2x, you're going to have nice fine increments between your gears, meaning you can keep your RPM in sort of a sweet spot for yourself and still get quite a low climbing gear and a pretty good high gear or sort of top speed out of the whole thing as well. The rims on here are WTB. They're an internal 25 millimeter rim width, which, I mean, I would say ideally, because this is operating on a 2.25 tire width, I'd probably prefer to see a little bit of a wider rim, but this isn't super narrow. Some bikes in this category would still be coming with stuff like 21 millimeter wide rims. Now, the reason that I would want a little bit wider rim is a little bit of a mountain biking sort of thinking. The wider the rim, the softer you can ride your tire without having issues of, when you're going around corners, having your tire wanting to sort of fold over on itself. So you can get, if you were bike packing through some really bumpy, lumpy sort of terrain, you'd be able to ride that much softer a tire, let your tire be your suspension and your extra traction in that sort of a situation. Like I said, 25 millimeters is not too narrow. I would have loved to have seen a little bit wider though. So we're looking at through axles. We also have a pair of braze-on mounts here. So this is going to be really important on a bike of this sort of classification, is making sure that we've got a way that we can actually put a full wrap fender on here. So we've got a fender mounting sort of a spot up here. We have another one hidden behind that front derailleur down at the bottom. And then we've got our extra sets of bolts so that for those people that are still running things like panniers, pannier racks, you have an easy way to set things up on there. Now, a cool detail, because most through axles these days are requiring you to have a 5 or a 6 millimeter Allen key, they've actually gone out of their way to make sure that they're still using a quick release handle on that through axle, and that's on the front and rear wheel. So that, once again, quite a practical sort of a thing for a touring bike. Another neat feature as far as small details is on this mechanical brake that they're using here. they're using this little miniature, almost like a V-brake noodle, as just a nice way to sort of help transition the brake cable, go around this little bit of a bend. It's just a really nice detail that I can't say I've seen on any other bikes out there. Now, one of the things that might look a little bit unsightly to a lot of people is the fact that we have all external cable routing on here. Once again, this is pure practicality of being able to service things and not worry about threading things through a frame. Also on a chromoly frame, it's not quite as common to have internal cable routing, but I think that this is perfectly practical, and serviceability on a bike of this sort is going to be sort of a paramount in the owner's mind. They want to be able to look after things with as little hassle as possible. Now, one of the things that, of course, to me would be of interest, because no matter what bike I have, I ride it like an idiot, and I like to put dropper posts on everything. This does have hidden down below here. There is an actual dropper cable mount. So this is a 27.2 post. You'd be able to put a 27.2 dropper on here. It would just mean putting on a second little lever down here, like a Crank Brothers or an Easton, sort of a secondary dropper release. Yeah, even for this sort of a category, I think that dropper posts are an extremely practical, handy, easy, increasing ease of use sort of a thing for a bike. Looking at more details, we've got a WTB Coda saddle. This is quite a popular saddle, probably the second most popular in WTB's lineup. So for people who like the Volts, this is quite often another saddle that those same people would like. A little bit stubbier in length, but nice to see that they're actually putting a chromoly railed saddle on a bike that I think is still pretty incredible value. Now, a weird thing I found on this bike, this seat post, if I was to buy this bike, I would have to buy an aftermarket seat post to be able to get the seat to the height that I would like. So I think this was maybe only a 300 or a 350 millimeter long seat post. I have freakish long legs, so I would fit the size large, but I would have to get a different seat post, which I would be upgrading to a dropper post anyways, so that's not that big of an issue. Stepping forward, one of the nice things that gives this a little bit of a retro flair is the fact that we have this sort of a shape to the fork with the actual offset in the fork being created through this. I don't even know what they call this shape on old school road bikes, but that is sort of an old school look to have that sort of a shape. We've got our 3 cargo mounts on the fork. Speaking of mounts, there are a pile of them. So we've got a bento box mount up here, a few bottle mounts in the down tube, on the seat tube, and underneath the down tube. So really nice stuff. The head tube on here is using an integrated angular contact sort of bearing, which means we don't have cups pressed into the frame. The bearings are being dropped directly into machined spots in the frame. I wish I could say that I was super familiar with this headset size, but it looks like it's a larger diameter. I'm used to things like the Marin 4 Corners being a bike that's somewhat in this category, and it, I think, has smaller bearings in there. But I don't think that this is enough to actually put a tapered steer tube fork on there if you ever wanted to. Just a thing that I think people might have questions about, so I have to admit that I'm not in the know of what's going on there. Now, being very new school in layout here, we're looking at these really, really swept out drop handlebars, and then they are going to be size specific. I believe these are 46 centimeters wide, so that'll typically be hood to hood, and then obviously with all of this sweep, you're going to have much wider bars in the drops. The idea there is basically about, especially if you're going to be loaded up with stuff on this bike, if you put your hands in the drops, you're going to have that much sort of a broader a base, that much more leverage to tell the wheels where you want this bike to go instead of the wheels telling you where it's going to go. As I mentioned, with those through axles and with the brakes, mechanical brakes, front and rear, once again, there's that noodle detail, just helping to guide the brake cable into the brake there. That quick release. What else can I show you? I mean, the one thing that once again, we've got a weird thing there. If you look this bike up, the one thing that I notice, because I will sometimes on bikes like this, if I see an angle that looks a little bit suspicious, I will check with my phone app just to see what angles look like. This bike's geometry chart might be a little bit wrong in the head angle. I believe this bike is supposed to be a 73-degree seat tube angle, and it says a 69-degree head tube angle. In reality, my phone tells me that's a 74-degree seat tube angle, which I'm perfectly fine with. But it does say the head tube angle is more like 71 degrees. So I don't know, maybe if this is a rep's personal bike, maybe it's a pre-production bike. All that said, I also don't think that 71 degrees is a bad head tube angle. It's in the same neighborhood as the Marin Four Corners that I personally ride, and I think that that bike rides awesomely. So that is my coverage of this bike. Are there any weak points? That seat post is too short. I would personally buy one of these, and quite honestly, I would do a complete upgrade, because I would completely undo all of the wisdom that they've put into this build, and I'd turn it back into a hydraulic braked one-by bike. But that's because I wouldn't be bike packing. I would be treating this as a drop bar adventure mountain bike instead of a drop bar adventure bike packing bike. So I think this is a great bike. Kudos to all the people at Brodie, and thankfully we have brands that are putting out bikes like this, because if we were just reliant on the big guys, I think we would be stuck in a world where you would either have to spend $2,000 on a frame and fork and build something like this up, or you just wouldn't have access to a complete. You could pick up for $2,200 or probably $1,600-ish American, and get yourself into something that is an extremely practical, take it off the floor, pack this thing down, go do some really good adventure rides on. So thank you to Brodie for keeping that in-between world of high production, good value bikes with the niches that are too small for those big guys. Thanks guys, this is an awesome bike. And let me know in the comments, if you're an American, would this interest you? Would you cross the border, come to Canada, buy yourself a smoke and deal Chromoly adventure bike? All right, ciao.